The country south of the French city of Caen is open and rolling, a patchwork of wheat and beet fields broken by stone villages and dead-straight farm roads, and on a clear day a gunner in it can see for miles. In the summer of 1944, that long field of view was a death sentence for anyone trying to cross it. On the night of the 7th of August, that same ground lay black under a low ceiling of cloud, and moving out across it in column, for tanks abreast, came the leading squadrons of the 2nd Canadian Corps. There were no headlights. The only light was a gray wash thrown up where searchlights far to the rear bounced their beams off the underside of the cloud, and a low streak of orange tracer fired along the flanks to keep the columns on their line. Dust hung in the night air and turned even that faint glow into a blinding murk. Somewhere ahead, dug into a ridge they had held for weeks, were German anti-tank gunners who in daylight could kill a tank at well over a mile and had done it many times over. Tonight, those gunners could hear engines in the dark. They could not see what was coming. The men who had planned this attack were betting everything on that one fact, and what happened over the next 4 days would teach the German soldier on that ridge a lesson about the dark that the record still carries. If this kind of history is what you came for, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is listening. Now, back to the ridge. The reason the Canadians came in darkness lay in what the daylight had already cost them on this exact ground. By the first week of August 1944, the battle for Normandy had reached its turning point. 2 months after the landings, the Americans had finally torn open the western end of the beachhead in Operation Cobra, and General Patton's tanks were racing east through the German rear, meeting little serious resistance. For the men dug in around Caen, that breakout to the west changed everything and nothing at once. It threw open the door to a decisive stroke, but the German divisions facing them had not moved, and the ground in front of them had not changed. Whatever was won in the south would still have to be paid for in the north, on the same fields, against the same guns. The German command might still have pulled back in good order to the River Seine and saved its army. Instead, on the 6th of August, Hitler ordered a counterattack of his own near the town of Mortain. A thrust west toward the sea meant to cut off the advancing Americans. It would fail, and in failing it would draw German armor westward, away from the British and Canadian front around Caen. The Allied command had assumed for weeks that the Germans would swing back like a door, pivoting on a few strong hinges around Caen while the rest of the line gave way, and so Montgomery had shifted much of his weight to the west to add to the American blow. Out of that movement came the first glimpse of a far larger prize. If the British and Canadians could drive south from Caen toward the town of Falaise while the Americans swung up from the south, the whole German army in Normandy might be caught in the closing jaws of a pocket and destroyed. The push from the north would fall to the newly activated 1st Canadian Army under Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, and the cutting edge of that push will be the 2nd Canadian Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. That army had become operational only days before, on the 23rd of July, the first time in the war that Canada had put a full field army into the field under its own flag, and Totalize would be the proof of what it could do. The pressure to move was real. Off to the west, the British Second Army had thrown its own weight south in Operation Bluecoat, dragging German armor away from the Canadian front. And once the American breakout was loose, there was a closing window in which a hard southward blow from Caen might trap the whole German force in Normandy before it slipped back across the River Seine. Simonds had little time to prepare, and the ground in front of him was the worst possible place to be in a hurry. It would be the first great attack the Canadians had ever mounted under their own army command, and the ground chosen for it was ground his men had already learned to hate. The plan took its shape from a hard reading of the map. The dominating high ground south of the ridge, the rise the maps marked as point 122, looked down on every approach, and so long as the Germans held the forward villages and the guns sighted behind them, no daylight attack could cross the open fields between without being seen and broken. Speed by itself would not answer it, because the killing started the instant a vehicle came into view, and view, on that ground, reached for miles. Verrières was a long, low swell of farmland about 8 kilometers south of Caen, and through July it had been one of the deadliest places on the entire Western Front. The Canadians had gone at it before, and the ground had thrown them back each time with terrible loss. The first attempt, in the 3rd week of July, cost a fresh division more than 1,000 casualties for almost no gain. That had been Operation Atlantic, fought as the city of Caen itself finally fell, and it ended with the attackers pinned on the forward slopes and then pulled back off the little ground they had briefly taken. That fighting had run through the third week of July, alongside the great British armored push to the east, and it had carried the Canadians across the River Orne and into the southern suburbs of Caen before it ran headlong into the ridge. On the 20th of July, the assault battalions went at Verrières and the high ground beyond it in a downpour that grounded the supporting aircraft and turned the slopes to mud. The South Saskatchewan Regiment was caught in the open by a German armored counterattack and broken, falling back in confusion with heavy loss, and the units sent forward to steady the line were chewed up in their turn. By the time it was over, the Corps had learned, at a price, that infantry alone could not hold that forward slope, and that daylight on this ground belonged to the enemy. The worst of it came on the 25th of July, in an attack called Operation Spring. Simonds threw 2 infantry divisions against the ridge, and much of the fighting ran on into the daylight hours, straight into German positions that held the high ground and every long, clear field of fire that came with it. By the end of a single morning, the Corps had taken roughly 1,500 casualties, close to 500 of them dead. One company of the Royal Regiment of Canada was destroyed almost to a man. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel John Rockingham, fought its way into the village of Verrières itself and held it for 3 days against repeated counterattack, but lost some 200 men doing it, and its supporting tanks were knocked out one after another. The heaviest blow fell on a single battalion. The Black Watch of Canada, a Highland regiment recruited largely out of Montreal, lost its senior officers early to a storm of machine gun fire, and a young major named Frederick Griffin took command and pressed the attack up the bare forward slope into the teeth of the German guns. 60 of his men reached the crest of the ridge. 15 of them came back. Griffin's body was found later at the top, lying among his dead. That attack had been the largest set-piece operation the Canadians had yet mounted, and it too had opened in darkness, with the same trick of searchlight glow thrown up against the cloud, only to come apart once the daylight returned and the German guns could see again. The men who lived through it carried out a bitterness the official reports could not hold, and in the days that followed there were hard words up and down the chain of command over who had sent the Black Watch up that bare slope, and why. As the historian of one Canadian regiment described the ground afterward, the whole area looked like a charnel house, with bodies and burning vehicles strewn across it. When the histories were finally written, the 25th of July 1944 was the second costliest day in the entire record of the Canadian Army, surpassed only by the catastrophe at Dieppe 2 years before. And the ridge had not been taken. The Germans still held it, and they held it because the open country played to every advantage their weapons possessed. The weapon at the center of that advantage was the German 88mm gun. Designed before the war as an anti-aircraft piece, it had become the most feared anti-tank weapon in Normandy, a long, high-velocity gun that could punch clean through the front of any Allied tank at well over a mile and do it with the first round. On the flat, open field south of Caen, there was almost nowhere to hide from it. A tank that crossed that ground in daylight was visible to a gunner who had already paced off the range to every hedge and crossroads, and the German also had his heavy mortars and his multi-barreled Nebelwerfer rocket launchers registered across the same fields. The defense was laid out in depth, gun behind gun, with the heaviest weapons often sighted on the reverse slopes where an attacker could not see them until he came over the crest into their fire. The Germans had a way of fighting this kind of battle that they had refined over years on the Eastern Front. They grouped their anti-tank guns rather than scattering them, so that a whole cluster could open on the same target at the same moment from several angles. Catching a tank in a net of fire, it could not easily escape. Ahead of the main positions sat a thin screen of outposts whose task was to spot the attack early and call the fire down, and behind everything waited the armored reserve, ready to counterattack the instant a position was lost. It was a patient, layered defense, and on open ground it asked only one thing of the attacker, that he show himself in daylight. The Flak Corps alone controlled around 50 of the 88s in the anti-tank role, scattered through the sector and waiting. Further back stood the Tigers and the Panthers, their frontal armor thick enough to turn aside most of what the Allied tanks could throw at them, and a backstop of self-propelled guns ready to seal off any break in the line. To the north, around Caen, the country had been close bocage, a maze of high hedgerows and sunken lanes where a tank might be ambushed at 30 yards. South of the ridge, it opened out into clean tank country, long and flat and almost bare of cover. And that openness, which ought to have favored an attacker with room to maneuver, instead handed every advantage to the defender who could see across it. The German gunner did not need to move. He needed only to wait for a target to appear, and in daylight one always did. Daylight was the German gunner's ally. It let him see, and on that ground, seeing meant killing. So Simonds proposed something that cut against almost everything Allied armor had been trained to do. He would attack at night. He would send his tanks forward ahead of the infantry rather than behind them, in the dark, with no long opening bombardment to warn the enemy and wake the guns, and the foot soldiers would ride forward with the armor rather than walk into the fire. The German gunner would be robbed of his sight, and speed and surprise would have to carry the columns through the killing zone before the defenders could recover their balance. It was an enormous gamble. Armor and darkness had never mixed well, because tanks that cannot see get lost, run into one another, and blunder into ditches and craters. To make it work, Simonds and his staff would have to solve, in a matter of days, and at a scale no one had attempted before, 3 separate problems that had defeated every previous attempt on this ground. Simonds was the man to try it. At 40 years old, he was the youngest corps commander in the army, a cold, exacting, formidably intelligent officer who had thought harder about the machinery of the attack than almost anyone of his rank. Years before the war, as a young gunner, he had written a professional article asking what price an army paid for assaulting without proper support, and now he meant to supply that support in a form no one had seen. On the 30th of July, days after the slaughter at Verrières, he summoned his senior officers to his headquarters in a chateau northwest of Caen. There was complete silence in the room. He began with a story rather than the plan, the recent deeds of a Canadian company in Italy that had seized a river crossing and held it against everything thrown at them, refusing to give in even when cut off and under heavy fire. There was an edge in his voice as he told his commanders he expected exactly that refusal from them, whatever it cost. The officer he held up had won the Victoria Cross only weeks earlier in Italy, holding a small bridgehead across a river against repeated armored counterattack, and the lesson Simonds drew from it was blunt. A unit that had lost touch with its neighbors, that found itself cut off or under heavy fire, was not thereby released from the duty to fight on. He wanted that idea fixed in the mind of every man in the room before a single tank moved. Some of the men sitting there wondered whether he was accusing the units broken at Spring of having simply given up. No one dared ask. He told them the attack at Verrières had been a success in the only way that mattered, because it had pinned the German armor in front of Caen and made the American breakout possible. And then he told them the time had come for a knockout blow, and that no division would stop until every last reserve had been thrown in. Then he laid out how the next attack would be made, and it was unlike anything they had been trained for. The plan was issued in the first days of August, which left almost no margin. Whole brigades had to learn a method none of them had practiced, moving by night in close column behind a rolling barrage, and there was no time for the kind of rehearsal such a thing would normally demand. Much of the detailed work fell to the gunners. It was the searchlight crews of the Royal Artillery, the men who handled what the Army called movement light, who would throw the glow up onto the cloud, and it was the signalers with their directional wireless sets, together with carefully plotted tracer and marker fire, who would try to hold 8 columns of armor on a straight line through the dark. The whole scheme rested on staff work done at speed and tested for the first time in battle. The first problem he had to solve was the infantry. Tanks alone could not break a defended line. They could not dig out the anti-tank guns and the entrenched infantry whose whole job was to kill tanks. And so the foot soldiers had to go forward with the armor and arrive on the same objective at the same moment. On this ground, walking, they would be cut down by machine gun and mortar fire long before they got there. Simonds wanted them carried, in his own words, in vehicles that were proof against bullets and shell splinters. No such vehicle existed in the Allied inventory in anything like the numbers he needed. So he had one built. Across the Canadian and British divisions, there were tracked self-propelled guns called priests, American-built vehicles that carried a 105mm howitzer in an open mount. The artillery regiments happened to be handing their priests back and re-equipping with towed 25-pounder guns, which left dozens of the hulls free. Simonds ordered 76 of them stripped. In an advanced workshop behind the lines, under an engineer officer named Major Wiggin and a program given the codename Kangaroo. Fitters pulled out the howitzers, plated over the gun openings, and welded extra armor onto the fighting compartment, much of it steel cut from the wrecked landing craft still lying on the invasion beaches. Each assault division would get around 30 of the converted hulls. The work was done at speed in the last days before the attack, and the result looked like exactly what it was: a gun vehicle with its gun torn out and its open top left bare to the sky. Inside, a section of infantry could ride crouched behind armor thick enough to turn small arms fire and shell fragments, close on the heels of the tanks, rather than cross the killing ground on their feet. Other commanders in Normandy had seen the same problem and written about it at length. Simonds was the one who had the answer built in a workshop and put into the field inside a week. What rolled out was an armor box on tracks that could carry a section of infantry forward in the wake of the tanks, shielded from the bullets and splinters that would otherwise have killed them in the open. A single converted hull could carry about a dozen men, packed in behind the steel, and for almost all of them the night of the attack would be the first time they had ever gone into action, riding rather than walking. The soldiers called them defrocked priests, or simply kangaroos. They were crude, improvised, thrown together in a few days. They were also the first purpose-converted tracked armored personnel carriers ever taken in a battle, and the idea behind them, that infantry should ride into the fight inside armor instead of walking into it, would outlast the war and become a permanent feature of every modern army. On the night of the attack, that one piece of improvisation would be the difference between a brigade that lived and a brigade that bled. The second problem was seeing and steering in the dark without giving the whole plan away. Here, Simonds borrowed and sharpened a technique the Corps had already begun to experiment with. Anti-aircraft searchlights were lined up well behind the start line, and their beams were aimed upward, at the base of the clouds rather than at the enemy, so that the light scattered and came down as a dim, diffused glow across the battlefield, just enough for a driver to pick his way forward. The soldiers called it artificial moonlight, or Monty's Moonlight, after the army commander. To keep the columns from wandering off their line of advance, Bofors 40mm guns were positioned along the flanks and fired bursts of orange tracer straight down the axis of the attack, a glowing thread to follow through the dust, while radio direction signals and marker shells gave further guidance. The columns crossed the start line a little before midnight on the 7th of August, the Canadians on the left of the road, the Highlanders on the right. Almost at once the night did to the armor what the dark always does. Dust thrown up by the tracks, and the bombing hung in the windless air and turned the dim moonlight into a choking, blinding fog. All four Canadian columns lost their way at one point or another, tanks drifting off the tracer line, commanders standing in their turrets and straining to read ground they could barely make out, whole groups halting to feel for their bearings before pushing on again. And yet the columns kept moving, and that was the whole point of the thing. The German forward gunners, the men whose 88s had ruled these fields by day, were now firing blind into noise and muzzle flash, unable to pick out a single tank until it had already rolled past their muzzles and was gone into the dark behind them. By the first gray light of the 8th of August, the leading columns had driven roughly 3 miles into the German position. On the left, the 51st Highland Division had pushed through Tilley-la-Campagne and come up to the village of Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil, where the infantry dismounted from their kangaroos within 200 yards of their objectives and overran the defenders before the Germans could react. Tilley-la-Campagne was a place the Canadians knew well and hated, a small fortified village that had thrown back attack after attack through the daylight of July, and now it fell in the dark almost as an afterthought as the columns rolled past it. Where the leading tanks met the German forward positions, the flail tanks went to work beating their chains through the minefields to open lanes, while the gun tanks shot the outposts apart at point-blank range before the defenders could make out what they were firing at. Prisoners came in dazed and blinking, many of them taken still in their holes, unable to say how the attack had got on top of them so quickly. The Canadian columns had rolled past Roquencourt and reached Synthos, well down the Falaise road. Behind the leading armor, the slower infantry went to work clearing the ground the columns had bypassed in the dark. The South Saskatchewan Regiment, a battalion that had been savaged in the July fighting and was still hundreds of men short, leaned into the barrage and took Roquencourt in a clean, textbook attack. On the right, Maceurne and Fano-Marmion, The fortified villages that had anchored the German hold on Verrières and drunk so much Canadian blood through July were finally cleared by the Fusiliers Mont Royal and the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, the latter losing 2 commanding officers in succession before the work was done. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, the same formation that had been bled white in the summer's attritional fighting, reached every one of its objectives and brought in hundreds of prisoners. By around noon on the 8th, the entire Verrières Ridge was in Allied hands. The same ground that had cost 1,500 casualties and gained nothing in the daylight of late July had been taken in a single night. The cost of taking it told the story more plainly than any argument could. In the 4th Canadian Brigade, whose assault companies rode forward inside the improvised Kangaroos, the loss for the night came to 7 men killed and 56 wounded. In the 6th Canadian Brigade, fighting that same night on foot in the older way, the loss came to 68 killed and 192 wounded. The armor around the infantry and the darkness around the armor had cut the killing by something close to 10-1. The German defensive position south of Caen, the position that had held all summer, had been shattered, and it had been shattered in the dark. This was the heart of what made the German soldier dread these Canadian night attacks, and it had nothing to do with legend. It was mechanical. The German defense on this ground was built around long-range, observed fire. The 88 that killed at a mile, and the mortar crew that dropped its rounds onto a map referenced the instant a target showed itself. Every part of that system needed sight. Take away the light, and you took away the range. And a gun that could kill it over a mile in daylight might not make out its target until it was a few hundred yards off in the dark, by which time the tanks were already among the positions, and the whole advantage had flipped. The Canadians had not made their tanks any stronger than a Tiger or a Panther. What they had found was a way to make the Germans' single greatest strength, his gunnery, useless for as long as the night lasted. For a defender who had spent the summer certain that nothing could cross those fields and live, the discovery that a whole armored corps could come through in the dark and be sitting on his ridge by breakfast was its own particular kind of dread. What happened next showed the other half of the lesson, which was that the darkness protecting the Canadians lifted with the dawn, and when it lifted, the German gunner got his eyes back. The breakthrough had gone better than anyone dared hope, and now the plan called for the 2 armored divisions held in reserve, the 4th Canadian and the 1st Polish, to pour through the gap and drive on toward Falaise. Here, Simonds hesitated, and the reason he hesitated is itself part of the record. A deserter from the 89th Division, said to have been a Yugoslav conscript pressed into German service, had slipped across the lines and told his captors that his division had just relieved the 1st SS Panzer Division on this front. Simonds did not realize that the 1st SS, the Leibstandard, had in fact been pulled away to the west to join Hitler's counterattack at Mortain. He assumed instead that it had merely dropped back to stiffen his second line in front of him, and that belief made him cautious. Rather than send his armor straight on while the enemy was still reeling, he chose to pause and call down a second heavy bombing, this time by the Americans, to break that imagined second line before the advance resumed. The pause cost him the morning, and the bombing cost him far worse. None of it was precise. The searchlight glow shifted with the cloud and could fade away when the cover thinned. The tracer gave a line to hold, not a road to follow. A driver shut down inside a tank, half blind in the dust, had to trust a thread of orange light off to one flank and the dim shapes of the vehicles in front of him, and hope the column had not already drifted. It was navigation by nerve and guesswork as much as by instrument, and Simonds and his staff understood that. They accepted that some columns would lose their way in the dark, and wagered that even a confused advance by night would cost less than a clean one by day. The plan called for 8 columns in all, 4 of them Canadian, and 4 from the 51st Highland Division on the far side of the Caen-Falaise road. Each column was built 4 vehicles wide, the gun tanks at the front, then the engineers and the flail tanks that beat lanes through the minefields with whirling chains slung from a rotating drum, then the infantry packed into their Kangaroos. They would drive straight through the German forward line in the dark to objectives 3 or 4 miles deep, and the slower infantry coming up behind would clear whatever was left stunned in their wake. The third element was firepower, used in a way that fit the darkness rather than fought against it. Instead of a long opening barrage that would wake every gun on the ridge, Simonds arranged for the heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force to strike first, hammering the villages on either flank of the corridor while the columns moved up the middle. Air Marshal Harris, who commanded Bomber Command, was uneasy about sending his heavy bombers against targets so close to friendly troops in the dark, and only agreed once his officers convinced him that color marker shells would hold the bombs on the correct ground. It was a real risk, and every man involved knew it. The heavy bombers worked from thousands of feet up, in the dark, against a front line that on the map lay only a short distance from the troops they were meant to shield. One drifting marker, one crew that misjudged its run, and the bombs would come down on the very men waiting to attack. Harris weighed that and let the operation go forward. On the night of the 7th of August, around 1,000 Lancaster and Halifax bombers came over and dropped close to 5,000 tons of bombs along the flanks of the advance. The bombing largely did its work, though it had to be cut short partway through when smoke and dust began to swallow the markers. Once the columns crossed the start line, the artillery opened, and it opened with a weight the Corps had never massed before. Hundreds of field and medium guns, by one count 360 of them, fired 60,000 shells in the first hour alone, a moving wall of fire that walked ahead of the tanks, while other guns fired flares to thicken the artificial light. The barrage was set to lift forward in timed steps as the columns advanced, a curtain of shell fire crawling just ahead of the leading tanks, close enough to keep the German infantry pinned to the bottom of their holes and far enough back not to catch the Canadians coming up behind it. It asked exact timing of gun crews who could not see the men they were covering. For the defenders, the effect was a wall of noise and flung earth marching toward them out of the blackness, and behind it, coming on, something they could not yet make out. This was the storm into which the German defenders were plunged a little before midnight, a storm in which they could hear armor and gunfire all around them, and yet see almost nothing of where it was or where it was going. It would be a mistake to picture the men waiting on that ridge as anything other than professionals. The Germans held the sector in two defensive lines, with 3 divisions in depth. Along the front was the 89th Infantry Division, which had arrived only on the 4th of August and taken over the Verrières positions the following night. For years afterward, the popular account of these battles leaned heavily on the memoirs of Kurt Meyer, the young commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, who told the story as though his understrength battle groups had held off the Canadians almost single-handed. The records tell something more sober. Meyer's division was real enough and dangerous, and it would do terrible damage before the fighting was done. But it was not alone, and it did not hold the forward line on that first night. The 89th was at full strength when it took over the line, 12,000 men with their own artillery, their own anti-tank guns, and a mass of heavy mortars and Nebelwerfers. And behind it stood the 12th SS and the battered but still dangerous 272nd Division. This was a deep, layered, well-armed defense held by soldiers who knew their trade. And on open ground in daylight, it had already broken every attack the Canadians had thrown at it. The question Simonds was about to answer was whether the same defense could be broken in the dark. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there is far more in the record still to cover. Every like puts this story in front of someone who has never heard it, and your support is what keeps these films coming. A little after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, hundreds of American bombers, most of them B-17 Flying Fortresses, came over to strike ahead of the advance. They flew into heavy German flak. The formations broke up, and a number of aircraft released their loads short onto the Canadian and Polish troops waiting below. Part of the disaster came down to a deadly accident of color. The ground troops were setting off yellow smoke to mark their own positions for the aircraft above, while the Americans had chosen yellow as the color of their own target marking flares, and the men on the ground had no way to tell the bombers what the smoke beneath them really meant. Around 315 Allied soldiers were killed by their own air force that afternoon. The 1st Polish Armor Division was badly hit before it had properly begun to move. The North Shore Regiment, while back near Caen, lost close to 100 men, and the commander of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, Major General Rodkeller, was wounded. The same kind of tragedy would strike the same army again only days later, during the next operation, when American bombers once more dropped short onto Canadian and Polish troops. The lesson that the air and the ground were not yet speaking the same language was being written in friendly blood. It was the kind of mistake that came from doing something new at the very edge of what the equipment allowed, sending massed heavy bombers in close support of men who had no direct way to talk to them. It would take hard changes in marking and signaling, paid for in exactly this way, before the men in the air and the men on the ground could be trusted to fight the same battle without killing one another. By the time the advance got moving once more, the chance had gone. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had started west for Mortain, had turned back, and its battle groups, including the Tiger tanks of its attached heavy battalion, were arriving on the very ground the Canadians now had to cross. Kurt Meyer had spent the morning pulling together everything he could reach, a battle group under one of his most aggressive officers, a clutch of tanks and assault guns, and the heavy Tigers coming up behind, and he pushed them straight at the breakthrough before the Allied armor could gather its second wind. Through those hours, the German battle groups fought to build a fresh line across the Falaise road, south of the ground lost in the night, trading space for time and making the open field charge for every yard. And the sun was up. By late afternoon, in the words of one Canadian historian, German armor and long-range anti-tank guns had regained control of the battlefield in the wide-open country that suited their weapons so well. The night had belonged to the Canadians. The daylight, once again, belonged to the 88. It was into that daylight, around 12:30 on the 8th of August, that one of the most famous tank commanders of the war rode out to make his last attack. Michael Wittmann was an SS officer who by this stage of the war had been credited with destroying something like 143 Allied armor vehicles on the eastern and western fronts, and who had become a national celebrity in Germany 2 months earlier for an ambush at the town of Villers-Bocage, where from a single Tiger he had torn a British column to pieces, knocking out something like 14 tanks and a string of other vehicles in a matter of minutes. Now acting as the commander of his heavy tank battalion, Wittmann led a group of 7 Tigers north up the Caen to Falaise road to throw the Allied units off the high ground near Saint-Ignan. Kurt Meyer, not understanding that the Canadians and British had halted only to wait for their own bombers, had ordered the counterattack to win back the lost ground. The Tigers came on across open country in broad daylight, and they came straight into a trap. Allied tanks, dug in and waiting in the fields and around the grounds of the chateau at Gomsnil, caught the Tigers in a crossfire. In a short, violent action, the Germans lost 5 of the 7, Wittmann's among them. His tank, turret number 007, was hit and brewed up so violently that the turret was blown clean off the hull. Wittmann and his entire crew were killed. Who fired the fatal shot has been argued over ever since. And this is one of the places where the record genuinely divides. For decades the credit went to a British gunner, Trooper Joe Ekins of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, firing a Sherman Firefly with its powerful 17-pounder gun, and Ekins was recorded that afternoon as having knocked out 3 Tigers in a matter of minutes. In more recent years, historians going back over the evidence have pointed instead to the Canadians, and specifically to the Sherman Fireflies of a squadron of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment, positioned at Gomsnil under Major Sidney Radley Walters. The Tigers had driven into a crossfire between the 2 units, and both could claim a share of the kills, which is one reason the argument has lasted so long. The strongest physical clue is the wound itself. The single penetrating hit on Wittmann's Tiger went into the left side of the hull, the side that faced the Sherbrooke position as the Tiger drove past, and a shot from the British squadron, off at a very different angle and a far greater range, would have struggled to strike there at all. One of the British veterans who first set down the claim for Ekins later went back and interviewed the Canadian crews, and, in his own subsequent account, he no longer insisted the kill belonged to his own regiment. The Germans, for their part, found it almost impossible to accept that a tank had killed Wittmann at all, and for a time persuaded themselves that only naval gunfire or aircraft could have done it. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The most decorated Panzer ace of the campaign died in a daylight counterattack across open ground, the very kind of ground and the very kind of fight that the Canadians had spent the night before so carefully refusing to give him. His body lay lost for almost 40 years, until a road construction crew uncovered the remains of the crew in 1983, and Wittmann was buried at last in the German War Cemetery at Locham. The darkness, though, was no guarantee on its own, and the Canadians learned that too, at a brutal price. Late on the 8th and into the 9th of August, with the advance stalling, the commander of the 4th Canadian Armored Brigade broke his force into 2 battle groups, each named for its commander, and sent them on through the night. One was to take a village in the German rear. The other, built around the British Columbia Regiment, an armored regiment of Sherman tanks, carrying 3 companies of infantry from the Algonquin Regiment, was ordered to push on and seize a piece of high ground further south, known as Point 195, that overlooked the next river valley. It was led by Lieutenant Colonel Donald Worthington, who at 31 was the youngest regimental commander in the division, a man remembered as full of energy and quick to seize an opening. They set off in the dark in the early hours of the 9th, and in the dark and the dust they went wrong. Enemy fire pushed the column off to the east, and when the sun came up, Worthington reported with confidence that he was on his objective and asked for support to hold it. He was not on his objective. His battle group had drifted some 4 miles, around 6.5 kilometers, off course, and had halted on a different piece of high ground near Point 140, sitting almost on top of a 12th SS battle group, equipped with Tigers and Panthers. He did not grasp the mistake until his radios failed and the fire came in from every side. Through the daylight of the 9th, the isolated force was destroyed. A German anti-tank line that included a number of 88s opened on the trapped tanks, and one Canadian tank after another was knocked out and set ablaze. A German lieutenant taken prisoner by the Canadians left a description of what it was like inside that pocket, of Tigers and Panthers closing in to encircle the hill, of one Canadian tank after another going up in smoke and flame, of survivors trying to reach a small wood close by, only for the wood itself to come under sustained attack from fighter bombers. By the end of the day, the battle group had been wiped out in a single field a few hundred yards across, where it made its last stand. Accounts of its losses vary, as they so often do for a unit destroyed where few of its men came home to file a report, but the figures run to well over 200 casualties, with somewhere between 85 and 95 men killed, dozens more wounded, dozens taken prisoner, and around 47 tanks lost. The German records, in their turn, dismissed their own losses in the action as insignificant, while the Canadians counted them as heavy, and the truth of that disagreement was never reconciled. Worthington himself was killed on the hill, the same night that had carried the assault columns safely through the German line on the 8th had, on the 9th, carried Worthington 4 straight into the guns. Darkness was a weapon, but it was a weapon that cut the hand holding it the moment the navigation failed. Part of what doomed the battle group was something the Americans had already solved on their own front. By late July, they had worked out a system of direct radio contact between an air officer riding with the leading armor and the fighter bombers circling overhead, so that the tanks could call the aircraft down onto the enemy and warn them off friendly positions. Worthington had nothing like it. His force had broken into a position the Germans were desperate to hold, and the 1st Polish Armored Division lay less than a mile away. Yet with his radios gone, and no link to the aircraft above him, the men on the hill fought and died largely alone, while the very fighter bombers that might have saved them instead helped finish the wood where the survivors had fled. And then, to close the operation, the darkness was used one more time, and this time it was used exactly right. The high ground that Worthington had died short of still had to be taken. When Simonds learned that Point 195 was still in German hands, he demanded another attempt, and the task fell to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada, under Lieutenant Colonel Dave Stewart, one of the finest battalion commanders the Canadian Army produced in the whole war, an officer his men said commanded by earning their respect rather than demanding it. Stewart received his orders late in the afternoon and decided to take the hill in the dark. He went forward himself with a scout platoon to reconnoiter the route, reading the ground off the map, and as he came back he left scouts standing at points along the way to act as living signposts for the battalion. That night his Highlanders moved single file, quietly, straight through the German positions and up onto the high ground, with such trust in their leadership that they reached the objective largely intact. Stewart was up at the front, by his own account, because a commander cannot win battles from behind. When a battery of 17-pounder anti-tank guns came up, he sighted them himself to cover the approaches from the west and settled in to wait for the counterattack he knew was coming, while the Lincoln and Welland Regiment moved on a parallel line to guard his flank. The 12th SS, whose doctrine demanded an immediate counterattack against any lost ground, came at the Argylls again, and each time the Highlanders met them with fire from a position they could not be shifted out of. The hill that had cost Worthington force its very existence in daylight was taken and held by a battalion that walked onto it in the dark. The same lesson, written twice in the same week, in the same open country, against the same enemy. Operation Totalize ended early on the 11th of August, 1944. It had not reached Falaise, and Canadian writers ever since have tended to measure it by that failure, by the objectives left untaken, and the breakout that ground to a halt on the second day. Measured another way, it had done a great deal. The Corps had finally taken the line of villages along Verrières Ridge that had stopped the cold in July. It had carried the front roughly halfway to Falaise, some 8 miles, in a few days, over ground that had not moved in weeks. The attack had wrecked the German plan to renew their own offensive in the west, forcing them to split their armor to deal with the danger driving down from the north. And it set the stage for the next attack, Operation Tractable, launched within days, which carried the Canadians and Poles forward again until, by the third week of August, the jaws of the pocket closed around the German army at Falaise, and tens of thousands of men were killed or taken. Tractable opened on the 14th of August, and Simonds reached again for the same logic, though this time in daylight, laying down a vast smoke screen to blind the German gunners much as the night had blinded them a week before. The attack carried the Corps across the little river Lyson and on toward Falaise, and it was marred once more by bombs falling short from the Allied air forces onto their own troops, the second such tragedy in a week. As the pocket drew shut, it was the 1st Polish Armored Division, the same formation bombed on the opening morning of Totalize, that took and held the high ground at Mont Ormel astride the German line of escape, beating off furious attacks from both sides until the trap was sealed. When it closed, in the 3rd week of August, the better part of 2 German armies had been destroyed in Normandy. The price of Totalize was about 560 men killed and 1,600 wounded, and that was a single operation inside a campaign that cost the Canadians close to 20,000 casualties, more than 5,000 of them dead, in the fight to free this one corner of France. The ideas that Simonds had improvised in the last days of July did not die with the battle. The Kangaroo, the armored box welded together out of old gun chassis and scavenged landing craft steel, had proved itself so plainly that purpose-built armored personnel carriers became a permanent fixture of mechanized armies the world over, and remain one to this day. The night attack, the deliberate choice to fight in darkness in order to rob an enemy of the long-range gunnery he depended on, entered the Canadian way of war as a hard, proven method, paid for in the blood of the men who first tested it. Most of this can still be found, if you know where to look. The ground itself is quiet farmland again, the same open fields rolling away on either side of the road from Caen to Falaise. Along that road, near the village of Synthos, lies the Bretteville-sur-Lys Canadian War Cemetery, where some 2,793 Canadian soldiers are buried, 91 of them never identified, drawn from almost every unit of the 2nd Canadian Corps that fought through these August battles. The men who fell earlier in the campaign, in June and the first days of July, lie a little to the north, near the invasion beaches, in the cemetery at Benny-sur-Mer. Above the Lyson Valley, near Point 140, a memorial overlooks the field where Worthington force was destroyed, and the Canadian flag flown there can be seen across the open, rolling country for a great distance. A wartime photograph taken by a French civilian in 1945 shows the burned-out hull of Wittmann's Tiger sitting in a field near Gomsnil, its turret gone, and Wittmann himself rests now at Lockham, not far from the men who killed him. What the record finally shows about that summer is plain enough. On the open ground south of Caen, in daylight, the German gunner was lord of the field, and Canadian blood proved it again and again through July. In the dark, the advantage changed hands, and the men who had owned those fields by day learned to fear the sound of engines they could not see, grinding up the Falaise road behind a wall of searchlight glow and a single thread of orange tracer. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, hit the like button, because one click tells the algorithm to carry it to someone who should hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you have not already. We go through unit war diaries, after-action reports, and the accounts of the men who were there, searching for the stories most people have never been told. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from: the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Poland, Germany, wherever in the world you are. And if someone in your family served, tell us about them, because these comment sections have become a place where families share what their fathers and grandfathers never spoke aloud. The men who advanced into that darkness, and the men who waited for them in it, deserve to be remembered. Because you are here, they will be.